Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. The Chief is the weekly paper you read for the best news about the city, state, and often federal civil servants, and the municipal unions that represent them. Richard Steier is editor, investigative reporter, and columnist, and my guest today. I should have said the feisty editor, columnist, because I love your editorials and your columns.
Thank you, Ronnie.
People should read the paper not just because they're interested in civil service or the unions, but because it really reports in depth more than any of our other local papers, the city news and the state.
Yeah. There was a while back I used to refer to the stuff that I do as the French pastry of the paper, but more and more in the changing news climate that we're in, I think that that stuff has to be an essential part of why people are going to buy the paper if it's going to be sustained over the long run, because a lot of the civil service news that once upon a time they could get solely from the Chief is now available elsewhere online.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that. But the Chief is just, people should really read it.
Yes, I agree.
And they can see it online, and it's then very good because you can go back and you can go all around the stuff. So we've got a lot of things to talk about. You recently talked about Linda Fairstein, and you were I thought, very level-headed because you quoted Norman and said, I don't think you had any questions about the fact that these kids were not guilty.
They were not guilty as far as I'm concerned in terms of the attack on the jogger. In terms of the attacks on other people in the park, at least 3 of them were on record after they had been sent to prison at parole hearings in which they admitted being part of those attacks. In terms of the other 2, you just don't know, Yusuf Salam and Corey Wise. But the problem ultimately, and the reason that Robert Morgenthau felt he had no choice but to vacate the convictions in 2002 was that once Matthias Reyes confessed and his DNA was the only DNA that was lifted from the jogger's body or from a sock that she had been wearing, it just completely blew up the case against the others, that you couldn't credibly say that they were involved, partly because if there's one thing that we know about teenagers, it's that they're sloppy. And the idea that they could have been involved in this sort of attack and caught up in a frenzy that would mix violence and sex and not have left behind some trace of themselves,
it's
just is implausible.
But it was really, I mean, I've only seen the first program. It's all based on this. What's the name?
When They See Us.
When They See Us. It's a 4
four-part series.
Different segments on Netflix, I think.
Yes.
I think she did, hopefully she did exaggerate the character that plays Linda Fairstein.
You don't know where she would have been getting that in terms of, I mean, in particular, what sticks out is when she's telling cops that every black male who is in that park is it's just a chilling sort of statement, and it's hard to imagine that a prosecutor in New York would have said something that blatant. And so that you have to think that maybe that was a case of the screenwriters and the director taking some dramatic license. And Ava DuVernay said afterwards that if she wasn't happy with how she was portrayed, that's partly her own fault for not talking.
That was a big mistake.
To me.
Yeah.
Most likely, yes.
Right. It ties in a way with all the discussions about criminal justice, police brutality, and what happens. And certainly I don't think the profile of the police was so different from reality.
I mean, the problem that you get to there is that they decided that once they had these kids in custody, once they got these confessions, that it was time to just go out and enjoy themselves. I mean, the talk about celebrations at Elaine's and the nights after. And it was something where ultimately the NYPD said that it wasn't until 7 months after the assault that they turned up DNA evidence. But you would have thought that once that happened, you had about a 7-month break between that point and the point that the first of the 2 trials began, and nobody thought to ask themselves, why don't we have any DNA from the kids at the scene on the jogger, that it's as if they just decided that it's a ground ball, we fielded it, and now we can just enjoy life.
And the perception of they're constantly harassing these, I mean, the questioning and getting finally for them to break down and say, yes, I did it or something. We see that on television all the time.
That's the sausage making part of the operation.
The basis of the Innocence Project, right?
Yeah, that there is that cops are allowed to lie to suspects. They don't have to tell them the truth.
Is that really right?
Yes, they can lead them to believe that one of their cohorts has been giving up everything.
Well, when is that going to come under question?
Well, it's come under question to some extent up until now, but until you change the law, and I think that there would be an argument that it would swing too far in terms of the other direction if you took that away from cops. But they are allowed to lie. It's the reason that a suspect in a serious crime probably should not be speaking without exercising their Miranda rights when they're told that you have the right to have an attorney present if you give up the right and blah, 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 blah. Right. You're making a real mistake if you decide, well, I've got nothing to hide.
Right. That's the point. So that we see reflected in a way in budgets and in the campaigns for DA and things like the changing in some of the criminal justice positions of district attorney. I mean, Philadelphia and now we have it in New York, right? Well, kind of four-way race. Is it four?
It's a seven-way race. There are 4 candidates who are given a serious shot as we're talking, which is not quite a week before the primary. But basically, the candidates are Tiffany Caban, Melinda Katz, Gregory Lasak, and Rory Lansman are the 4 who are given the best shot at winning among the candidates. And the interesting thing about it is that Caban is getting all this momentum because she got the endorsement of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and now she's just gotten the endorsement of the New York Times.
Right.
And it's a remarkable...
But do you think it's just because she got AOC's endorsement, or is it really because she's matching, like the campaign in Philadelphia where the reform candidate was really elected?
He was a reform candidate, but he had more experience than she did. She's got 6 years in the system, all of it as a defense lawyer. And some of the positions that she's taking in the debate on New York One, she was saying that she is in favor of closing Rikers Island, but she is also opposed to reviving the Queen's House of Detention to house some of the inmates who would need another place to go if Rikers shut down. And I mean, to me, that is unrealistic.
But don't you think she'll learn that very quickly?
She may learn it very quickly, but the idea that she could be elected while having that as a position, it's one thing if you're saying that and you're running for borough president or if you're running for Congress, but the idea that you're running for district attorney and you're saying that, it suggests that you don't really grasp just what the job is supposed to be about and just what you have to deal with in terms of people who are not small-time drug dealers, people who have committed violent crimes and who right now are not entitled to bail because of the
felonies. But it's also indicative of a beginning change, or maybe it's past that stage in our politics. I mean, we're now favoring most people who don't have the experience.
It's a reaction, I think, to what people have seen in other district attorneys' offices in New York.
And to Richard Brown.
There have been complaints that Brown did not adapt to the times. You also see people with all this experience. Joe Hines had a career as a prosecutor in one form or another, and yet you had all these bad convictions that cropped up and basically have tarnished his legacy as district attorney over a 24-year period. You had the situation in the Bronx where Robert Johnson was there for a long time, was criticized for a low conviction rate, and was also the DA who was stalling the Khalif Browder case to the point where they kept on putting the trial on hold even after the witness disappeared. And you had this young man spend more than 2 years in solitary confinement, 3 years behind bars, and wound up killing himself. If you're looking for culprits in terms of why that happened, one of them would be Johnson and his indifference, even in terms of Manhattan and the way that Cy Vance had treated the Harvey Weinstein case.
Well, now he's got a primary.
Or the case involving Trump's children and the apartments that they were selling down in Soho.
But he's now facing a primary fight. I mean, I think there's now going to be a new mounting of disagreement on District Attorney Gonzalez from Brooklyn. He's really adopted a whole platform of reforms, but heavily criticized by it too.
Because there is some question as to whether all of them are realistic, whether they're all achievable. He's got a track record to be able to run on, but it's still a question of whether he's leaning too far in the other direction. And part of that is a reaction to stop and frisk and the abuses that took place over. I mean, you were talking about a situation in which out of these stop and frisks, there were only 6% that were resulting in an arrest, another 6% that were occurring where a summons wound up being issued. Well, you're talking about a batting average where only 12% of the time was there any justification shown afterwards for doing the stop. I mean, if you were a Major League Baseball player, you'd be sent to the minors. It's impossible for anyone to believe that cops could be that off in terms of who they were stopping. And
now we've got the conflict in the police department with the Civilian Review Board, the opaque nature of their reporting, not reporting what happens to cops who violated or.
I think that's a big mistake that they made. I think that the interpretation that they have of 50A, that you can't disclose cops' disciplinary records or the outcome of disciplinary cases against them, that it just strikes me as impossible to believe that over the first 40 years of the law, the PBA, which is known for having very aggressive attorneys, didn't look to challenge that, and all of a sudden the police department decides that the way we've been doing it has been all wrong.
You think they're going to change?
Well, I mean, O'Neill said that he was going to look to change it. He said he was in favor of it after he had this police commission report back to him. But the city has done nothing to try and get it done before the legislature shuts down for the year. And so you have to question whether he really means it or whether he's saying what he thinks is politically palatable. Same thing in terms of de Blasio. They finally got a Democratic Senate where you don't have the Republican opposition to head off that bill. And de Blasio's basically been asleep at the switch.
Has he been asleep or just disinterested or away?
Well, any way you look at it, it doesn't reflect well on
Now,
it.
how many mayors have you had since you started?
I started when Ed Koch was mayor. I grew up during the Beam and Lindsay years, but as a reporter, Koch was the first that I covered.
Somebody once told me the trouble with John Lindsay, it was actually Barney Frank, the congressman.
Sure.
Said is that John Lindsay is giving good intentions a bad name.
Yeah, well, there are people who would say that de Blasio has done the same thing for progressivism.
Right.
That people may prefer to go back to referring to themselves as freaking liberals just because.
Exactly. Me.
Yeah.
This whole conversation about progressivism comes from up here there. I don't really believe somehow that it's this. I don't know how to explain it, but certainly his record doesn't necessarily show that he's, of course, a pragmatic progressive, but I just don't know. I'm at a loss for words with him.
Beyond policy positions, it's also some of the things that he has done in terms of people who have contributed money to him, and you see them piling up in terms of Rechnitz and Reichberg and the access that they were being given, Harendra Singh and the favors that the city was ready to do for him in terms of extending his lease at favorable terms in Long Island City until the feds intervened and indicted Singh.
And he's just not interested in really doing things. He likes to talk about it. So you can say that the legislature isn't following up on some of his major issues or something. Today, just recently, he's just now appointed a head of the housing authority. Now, what do you think of that appointment?
Well,
$400,000 salary.
Yeah.
Weekends in where does he come from?
Weekends in Minneapolis.
Minneapolis.
And he's coming out of an authority where I think there were 10,000 residents. Housing authority is almost 400,000.
And before that, he was in Cambridge, Massachusetts?
Yes, yeah. So
Is
it's
he
one of
going to
those.
get eaten up?
I think that there was apprehension on the part of people who have run larger housing authorities about taking this job just because they see it as being a meat grinder, and based on what de Blasio has done so far, they feel that he's not really committed to making the kind of changes that would be necessary, and beyond that, he's a lame duck. So,
Right, yeah. But, I mean, the deal, he's just making himself vulnerable again. Is it because you think he couldn't recruit anybody else?
I think that if they could have gotten someone who had run a major housing authority, that they would have. You know, it's just an awfully big task for Russ to take on. It could be that he's up to it, but I think there's going to be a substantial learning curve.
Let's go to another one of his appointments, and that is the Board of Education.
Yeah.
It's very difficult. We look forward to a new kind of Department of Education. And what we've seen now is turning out to be more divisive than it is helpful, right? It's also not sensible, I don't think. Did it start with their plan to eliminate or change the tests for the special high schools?
Basically, yes, because it was something where they just wanted to do away with it, and they were thinking in terms of the negative effect the test had had in terms of blacks and Latinos being able to gain admission to those 3 specialized high schools, but they were completely neglecting the fact that that test has benefited people in the Asian community, not just the Chinese, but also people from Indian backgrounds. And the idea that you're going to say, well, the test is no good, and Carranza had said earlier this year that you could tell that it was set up to prevent integration, to keep the system white. Well, at this point, something like 67% of the students being admitted to those 3 schools are of Asian background. And so it didn't do a very good job of keeping the system all white. What he's suggesting is that there are minorities who we don't really care about, that it's almost as if they're saying, look, if the Asians have to suffer, and he essentially said that he said that the schools are not just for the benefit of one particular group. And the idea that you wouldn't get blowback from the Asian community, as well as people who have come through those schools and who still take pride in it, you know, is extremely unrealistic, and the position they took was very divisive, and they're getting nowhere in the legislature in terms of trying to move this, and increasingly Carranza is just lashing out and making the problem worse.
Isn't the lawsuit against Harvard, isn't that before they came out with their announcement? One would think they'd be a little bit more sensitive.
You would expect, yeah, except that the mayor is an ideologue, and Carranza apparently is one also. And it's something where I had written recently that Carranza sounded more like a student protest leader than a person who was running a system with 1.1 billion.
We didn't read that in your column or editorial?
That was in my editorial, yes. And it's one of those situations where it's like they took the easiest, laziest way to go, we'll just scrap that test, when in fact there are all these other things that you have to deal with, including the fact that middle schools continue to be the weakness in the city system, and particularly in poorer neighborhoods. And they've done nothing. You could say Carranza's only been there 15 months, but de Blasio's been in office for 5.5 years at this point. What exactly was, I mean, this was understood that it was a problem. It was a problem under Bloomberg as well. It's not something that he created, but why wasn't there a greater focus? That should have been the point
of his emphasis.
Yeah.
Because they don't think, he doesn't delve into what he says. I mean, you get the feeling there's not deep thought into how he's developing.
No, that it's more about slogans than it is about really having thought through policies and how you attack a problem.
And now there's a suit against Carranza, isn't there? By
3 women who were demoted, and they say that it was because of bias against them, either because they were women or because they were the wrong type of minority and a woman as well. And you'll have to see how that plays out. But some of the things that not only they, but other people who have gone through this implicit bias training have said about the trainers suggest that the trainers are bringing this kind of baggage where they have shown an explicit bias in terms of some of the things that they have said, where they've been dismissive of, in one case, a woman who, when she was asked how it was that she got interested in the issues that they're looking to attack, talked about her grandparents being Holocaust survivors. And someone said, that's not relevant here. Well, it is, in terms of if it's shaping part of that person's reality. It's as if you're not coming from that particular background, you don't know how to relate, you don't know how to feel, and you're not going to know how to reach these kids that we're trying to teach. And
we skipped over the fact that they've retained now consultants. Is the object to have every single teacher in the system attend some of these workshops?
I think that that is the long-term goal, yes.
And how much was the budget? How much are they spending on it?
They have, I budgeted, I believe it's something like $23 million for the program overall.
And we've also heard complaints that they're really talking about white privilege.
Yeah.
That they are going the totally opposite direction of what some of the complaints are. So that's very divisive. We're going to just encourage more division between races.
Carranza seems to think that this is the way that you get to the problem, by attacking it as bluntly as possible. But again, it's something, you are the chancellor of the system. You are not an outside critic who is coming in and it just is guaranteed to get blowback. It has gotten blowback.
Yeah.
And I mean, there was a proposal that was made in the closing days of the session by State Senator Leroy Comrie, which would seem to be a much more comprehensive approach to dealing with the problem than de Blasio and Carranza's idea. It got there too late to get serious consideration. It's going to be on hold until next year. But it was dealing with things like reviving gifted and talented classes, which had been cut to shreds by Bloomberg, and de Blasio has barely lifted a finger in terms of restoring those type of programs, which very often will develop interests in kids that might make them more inclined to take the specialized exams. It's also dealing with test prep for all 6th and 7th graders, and a requirement that 8th graders take the specialized high school admissions test unless their parents specifically opt out. That these would all seem to be helpful ways of leveling the playing field, and it's something where, because de Blasio is dug in on something that's not going to get any traction in Albany, he's refused to even acknowledge that these might be ideas worth exploring.
And what does the UFT say?
UFT's been quiet.
Very quiet.
UFT has a good relationship with Carranza. They're hoping to get things done. There's something that was part of their contract that was reached last fall called the Bronx Plan, in which they are looking to deal with some of the more problematic schools, not just in the Bronx but in other boroughs. But the Bronx is where the problem is greatest, which is how it got that name. And I think that they are deciding that they are not going to look to rock the boat, that after tussling with Bloomberg and his chancellors and Giuliani more than his chancellors actually, I think the union has decided that there is value in having a mayor and a chancellor who is on the same page in terms of supporting issues that matter.
Don't you think that's going to backfire also?
Well, it could, but
now we see, I mean, it's getting more obvious that union heads are protecting the union rather than necessarily examining.
Well, they see it.
I don't mean to say that.
Yeah, no, they see it sometimes as being in the best interests of their members in the long run. It's something where Victor Gottbaum was very much appreciated by people for being so outspoken on issues and criticizing people who you wouldn't necessarily expect a union leader to criticize, but it also created problems for him within the labor movement and hurt him when he eventually looked to, after he retired from DC 37, become the head of the Central Labor Council, and he was defeated by someone who was far less qualified than him, but the UFT was one of the unions that supported that person. And
you know, we're coming to the end of this program, and I just wanted to say, I heard for the first time, basically, what happens in a federal agency when they decide to change a procedure or something by reading your paper. I mean, so I want to emphasize to people that they really do find in-depth stories and very interesting clues to what's happening. How do we tell them that? Do you want me to help advertise?
Well, it's something that we have looked to focus on. Some of the things that Trump is doing, where it's not rhetoric, where it's programs within the federal government in which he is looking to take away union rights, and in some cases actually bar union officials from being on the grounds during working hours, which would render them a lot less effective. We have started covering little by little private sector unions, simply because there are issues that they're dealing with that are relevant to what is going on in the public sector labor movement. There's also something of a realization that as public employee unions have become targeted by right-wing Republicans because they're seen as a big part of the Democratic Party, that it's going to be more important for those unions to find common cause with the private sector unions.
Right. Well, thank you. Now we're at the end. So read the paper, follow Richie, because he writes wonderful columns and editorials. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Ronnie.
Thank you.